So hello everyone, and welcome to Secure Data Access for Visualforce and Apex, CRUD, FLS, and sharing. My name is Jorge Cáceres. I have been with Salesforce for about 7 years now, and I am part of the Enterprise Security Tools Development team. And what my team does is that we develop applications that are used by our security engineers to manage the security assessments of vendors and any third party that does business with Salesforce. And we do all of these apps using our platform.
My name is Nitin Arya. I'm also part of product security team. I'm a security analyst. I'm not sure how many of you guys are familiar with the Apex review process. Show of your hands if you've ever done like a Apex review and fail and pass thing. I know it kind of hurts, but so yeah, I'm the person who fails and passes. And we also have help developers fix those vulnerabilities. We set up office hours, talk to devs. We also talk to internal Salesforce people who also build internal apps. If we find any bug, we help them fix it. So that's what our team does.
So before we continue, just the usual, please do not make, since Salesforce is a publicly traded company, please do not make any stock purchasing decisions based on anything that we may show you today. We're not going to show you anything new. These are all existing things. So our agenda for today, so we're going to start with some basic security, and we're going to talk about some things that are specific to Salesforce and some general security principles. Then we're going to talk about CRUD, which is, for those of you that don't know, it stands for create, read, update, and delete at the object level. Then we're going to talk about field level security, FLS, which is how you secure access to particular fields in an object. And then we're going to talk about sharing, which is how you secure access to particular rows in that object. And then we'll have a question and answer in it. And as with all the presentations, the decks will be available in the website, so you don't really need to take any pictures. So a little bit of introduction about security and the Force.com platform. So Force.com was designed to be flexible and support developers and business needs. Force.com provides many built-in protections to protect developers and their user base. But it's with this flexibility that when you're developing apps, you could inadvertently give access to a user to data that the administrator may not be giving them access to. And we're going to talk about why this happens and how you prevent that from happening. And as Nitin mentioned, all apps that go through our App Exchange review process have to pass all of this in order to be published in the App Exchange. And so for those of you writing apps for the App Exchange, this will be really useful. For those of you that just write your own apps, it's also very useful because it will protect your data. What we have found out is that this particular set of vulnerabilities, the CRUD and FLS, is the second most common vulnerabilities that our product security team finds when partners submit their apps for review. So a little bit about security background. Some of you may be familiar with the principle of least privilege. And just as the name implies, what it means is that when you are granting access to your data to a particular user, you should always give them the minimum that is required for them to execute whatever task they're supposed to. So you should not think ahead and say, well, later on they're going to need cases or some custom object and set up the profile with that. You should always think of, okay, this is the only data they need, and this is all I'm going to give them. And it's easy to give more access later with additional permission sets or something along those lines. And the other thing that you should keep in mind is the two different contexts in which Salesforce executes. So there is what we call the user context and the system context. User context is pretty much everything that you run out of the box in Salesforce is in user context, and which means that it enforces the user permissions, the field level security, and the sharing rules for that user. So when a user is accessing a layout or a list, you don't have to worry about any of this. That's Salesforce is going to take care of only showing what that user is allowed to see. However, Apex runs in system context, and that's why you need to be aware of this, because your Apex class is not aware of the permissions, so it's just going to, if you try to access a field that this user doesn't have access to, the Apex class is going to have access to it. So this is where things can be a little tricky. And to help you understand, what the difference is between CRUD, FLS, and sharing, it's easy to kind of see this spreadsheet here. So when we talk about CRUD, we're talking about object level. So we're talking about in a spreadsheet that would be, a particular tab or the whole spreadsheet. So the context is an object, and you will define this user can do whatever, any of those operations with this particular object. FLS refers to the field level, so in a spreadsheet that will be a column. So the administrator may decide that a particular field should not be accessible for this user or modifiable, and that's how they define it in the FLS. And sharing defines the access to the particular row. So in a spreadsheet like this, you will be saying, this particular usage should only see the records that they created. And when an object is defined as private, that's when this applies. If it's public access, then there is no sharing. So to demonstrate this, we created a simple app which will definitely fail the security review, but it's a good way to show you how these things work and how to fix them. So Nathan is going to talk about it.
Thanks, Jorge. So not that relevant, but just to give a quick intro of this application. So this demo app does this. So zip code, sometimes you see zip code is like 94014, and then there's a minus sign, and there's the second part of it. So what this app basically does is you give the first part and your address, and it pulls that second part of the zip code, which basically helps, for example, use UPS to precisely locate your address. That's the functionality of the app, and then we're going to go into the vulnerabilities, which we usually see in the applications that are submitted within the Salesforce. So, and this application has two profiles. It's pretty basic system administrator who has access to most of the functionalities within the app. And then there's this normal user account, and administrator have set some permission levels, For example, opportunities, that's like an object, and user is not supposed to see that. And then you have fields within objects. Object, if you're still confused a little bit, is just like accounts, contacts, leads, those are all objects. And then you have within accounts like name, revenue, and XYZ, anything that's like fields in there. So now what is CRUD? CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete, which are like basic, think of it like database operations, what you can perform on it, which is create, read, or update, or delete. That's why we kind of call it like CRUD. How do you implement CRUD? It's pretty simple. Suppose you have these objects here, as you can see on your screen, like accounts, cases, campaigns. You go to Salesforce UI, and you are like, well, this normal user is not supposed to see this information, so I'm just going to untick the accounts. Now, everything works perfect and as intended in a normal behavior if you're using normal Salesforce UI, but things get complicated when you give developers the flexibility to code their own Apex classes. And that's when you need to implement these security things yourself, and most likely programmatically. I don't know how to actually spell it. Okay. It's a long word for a nerd. All right. So Apex classes don't implement CRUD by default. That's what I was talking about earlier, is about that flexibility thing. When you're coding your own classes, then Salesforce can't like scan it and change it and implement it on your own, so you have to do it manually yourself. Visualforce Pages enforce CRUD by default only if you're using S objects. So you can call anything either via S objects, which is like standard objects. So if you're using standard objects, then Salesforce system is smart enough to know that you're calling a standard object. So yes, I'm going to check for all the permissions and everything. But there's so many scenarios where you don't want to use standard objects. You create your custom objects and wrapper objects and all that stuff. During that scenario, then you have to do it yourself. So how do you implement CRUD in code? It's pretty simple. It's just like 4 basic functions. Creatable is creatable, accessible, updatable, and deletable. So before any object, for example, accounts or contacts, you do contacts dot is accessible. So the Salesforce checks if that account object is supposed to be seen by this user or not. These are like really basic things you can, they're really basic thing, like it's just like one function, but it makes like a huge impact. Suppose your company is complying with some HIPAA and stuff like that, and your data just gets exposed basically just because you're missing this one tiny little function in front of your object. We're gonna kind of go into the demo now, where I'll show how that looks. This is another example. As you can see above, I'm doing, remember I was talking about S objects? So if you're like S objects, then it's fine. Then Salesforce is going to check for CRUD permissions, which are like create, read, update, and delete. If it's a wrapper object or a custom object, then you have to implement, you see this W object dot string, after that you have to do like is accessible or is updatable, then the proper permission set will be implemented there. Now I'm going to do a quick demo. I'm going to jump into my application. So here's my application zipped for DF16, and I do a search on it. And right now, but if you look at the top, these chatter, leads, accounts, contacts, orders, these are all objects. That's what we mean by objects. Cases, reports, dashboard, these are all like objects. And you see opportunities is not listed there. So in our permission set in that UI thing, I've done like this user, normal user is not supposed to see opportunities. But then there's a developer who built this application, and now if I do like a search as my user, he still sees the opportunities. And that's because he's creating his own custom object, and within the code that that developer wrote, he didn't check is accessible, updatable, that stuff, and that's why this user is able to see that data, which he is not supposed to see. Now we're going to jump into the code. So I have it open here. This is our basic Visualforce page. And this is the Apex class that I'm talking about right here. And if you see down here, let's go down to opportunities, which is right here. So this piece of line where I'm writing down is accessible. If I remove this part, is accessible, the user sees all of those opportunities. I add this, then our vulnerability is fixed. So I'm going to go to my Visualforce page here, and I'm going to point it to this right class, basically, or you can think of it like I just fixed it. I'm going to delete here, CRUD, save it, let's see. So here the opportunities are gone, right? Now this was like object level security, like the whole opportunities. What if you are like, well, I want my users to see the opportunity name, but not the amount. So that's like a field within opportunities, right? And to fix that, you need field level security. That's something that Jorge is going to talk about in a minute. All right, I'm going to jump back to presentation. All right, so what are the best practices for CRUD? Create, read, update, and delete. We always check CRUD permissions before making any operations in our Apex classes. Not checking for CRUD can give elevated access, basically. We always suggest users to perform these checks in the Apex classes, not in the Visualforce pages because of efficiency, because it runs from system context. But there are certain scenarios when users have to do it and they're like, there's no way around it and that's something we have to do. Then you can still do it from Visualforce pages, but that's not like the best practice. The right thing to do is you implement all of these checks in your Apex classes itself. Jorge is going to talk about field level security now.
Yeah, thank you, Nitin. So just one more additional to what Nitin was talking about. When we talk about S objects, we're talking about standard objects and custom objects. So if you create your own object, you know, the same rules apply. So FLS, as we said earlier, is field level security. And an administrator defines the access to the particular fields, you know, using, again, profiles or permission sets. And for this particular app, the administrator has decided that the user should not see the annual revenue. And that's why in here, it's not checked. I mean, there's two options in here is to either have read access or edit access. So in this case, the user should not be seeing that. And as you saw in Nitin's demo, the user can see that. So Apex classes do not enforce FLS because they run in system context, as we mentioned earlier. And Visualforce Pages do enforce FLS because they run in user context. However, they do not enforce FLS if you have dereferenced the object from the S object. It's a little confusing in there, but like in here, if your Visualforce page is saying, I want to access account.annual revenue, which is the field in the account object, Visualforce is able to determine that the user is not supposed to see that and it will not display that. However, if for some reason you're moving that to a wrapper object, and so now Visualforce kind of lost context of what the user is supposed to see or not, so in that particular case, the user will be able to see the revenue. And similarly to how you protect with the objects, you do the same thing with fields. So you have two particular functions that you can use for this, and is accessible and is updatable. So your code if you wanted to enforce this in your class, will look something like what's here at the bottom. So you have your class, and you have a method that is saying, get my account, and as you can see there, the developer is doing the correct thing, which is before doing anything with the annual revenue, is checking, is this annual revenue field accessible for this user? So if it is, then it's going to go ahead and do whatever you're supposed to do with it in your own application. So when does a platform stop respecting FLS? So as I mentioned earlier, is if you are staying within the context of S objects, everything will be respected. So here we have an account, we instantiate ACCT, which is an account, and we instantiate a wrapper object. And in this case, the developer is moving the annual revenue to a field in the wrapper object called revenue. So in the Visualforce page, if you access account.acct.annual revenue, FLS will be respected because Visualforce can make the link that that is a field for an account. But however, it cannot make that same determination in the wrapper object because at that point, it doesn't know that came from account annual revenue. So this is the kind of stuff you have to be careful for. So we'll show how this happens in our little app here. So as you saw with Nitin, here is the app, and the app right now is displaying the annual revenue, which is not supposed to, but since it's running in system context, then it's displaying it. However, if I go to the regular accounts layout, as you can see that the revenue field is not here because this is running in standard Salesforce, which can make the determination that the user is not supposed to see the account revenue. So we need to fix this. So similarly to what Nitin did for the object, so if we look right now at the Apex class that is behind that Visualforce page, you will see somewhere in here the revenue is being moved to the opportunity. Sorry, I lost it. Yeah, here it is. So here you can see then the developer is not doing any checking and is just moving the account.annual revenue into that wrapper object field, and that's why the user is able to see it on the screen. So in order to fix this, we have a class in here that already has that fix, and as you can see in here now, they say FLS check, and before moving that into that field is going to check that it's accessible and then move it. So if we now go and we tell our Visualforce page to use that controller, which has that fix, and we reload the page in our, you can see now that it's not displaying the annual revenue because it's being checked by the controller now. So to recap, the best practices for FLS is to, as much as possible, always stay within the S object references and not try to get out of that. And whenever you need to access a field, or some people have like, utilities then check the access, but you will iterate through all the fields in that object and make sure that the user has access to it. And this is something you have to do, like if you're doing delegate operations, like an account, in this case, like a revenue field, and you might be increasing, you definitely don't want that to be there, and it's going to be displayed in the Visualforce page. Now Nitin is going to talk about sharing and how you protect that.
Thanks. So sharing is the third aspect of security. So if you think of me as an object and my hands and legs as fields, then third aspect, can you guess what are we missing here? So third aspect is do I want me to see these people? Or I want to set this permission level where it's I can only see this row of people, these records, but I should not see the right side of the record. It's permission between the records of them. So it has nothing to do with objects or fields. So even though you fix CRUD, there's still going to be a sharing violation, which is I don't want these records, or I don't want company Coca-Cola to see Pepsi, but I want Coca-Cola to see, for example, Mountain Dew or something, right? So that's what this slide basically says, which is record level access. So that's what sharing is for. It's pretty simple to implement, but it's really hard to grab the concept of CRUD and sharing, why exactly do we focus so much on sharing? So how do you enforce sharing? By default, Salesforce classes do not enforce sharing. Again, you have to declare your classes as with sharing. So every time you're creating a class, just make sure that you always write down public, private, whatever class type you want, but with sharing. There are certain times when you don't want to declare with sharing, then you can just do without sharing. But sometimes we see developers, they just declare every class as without sharing, because they're well, we still declared it, but that's the wrong way, So we are well, you have to tell us why did you do without sharing. They're well, that's our business requirement. So I was really? Declaring everything without sharing? But so that's why sometimes conversation get a little awkward. So how do you enforce sharing? As I said, you always use with sharing. If you are not declaring any class with or without sharing, then what happens is it all depends on the class which is calling that class, and it inherits from them. It's not necessarily the class within which you define. So it's the caller class. That's what it kind of depends on. As you can see this example, public with sharing, class my controller enforces the sharing permissions. Public without sharing doesn't enforce the sharing permissions. Pretty straightforward. And now I'm going to show a demo, what happens if you don't declare with or without sharing, right? Mostly without sharing. All right, so let's go to accounts. So this is an account, and I'm saying these two records are visible to each other, right? Which is test account and United Oil and Gas. But now that's the bad app that we created, and I do a search for a normal user, and now you see he can see all the other records. So he should only see United Oil and Gas, and he should only see test account, right? So it's a pretty simple fix. We go to our controllers, and we just add this two-word magic keyword, and that's it. And then we go down here. Let's see if it works. Sharing, we save it. And there you go. Now we don't have any access problems in our application. Sometimes, actually it's in the next slide. So explicitly declare sharing or without sharing in your classes. If you must use without sharing, we encourage you to leave a comment block stating that why are you using without sharing, what's the requirement. If it's more redundant, then you can leave I'm using without sharing in this is class so that you don't have to do it again and again. Sharing, as I said, it's a different piece of security. It has nothing to do with CRUD, the object level or field level security. Sharing is a record level security, and it's totally separate from that. So writing down with sharing will not protect your application from CRUD. You still have to do all the stuff that we talked before this. Right, so to summarize everything, first we talked about CRUD, which is implemented on objects. It's the object level security. We talked about FLS, which was field level security. The sharing, we just talked about record level, and you implement it by declaring classes with sharing. we have a lot of resources that you can go ahead and learn. It's not that simple sometimes because there are like custom cases and everything. So you can read the documentation for it. There's a Trailhead module that we just created, so you can go through those modules and kind of learn all the security best practices. It also includes like cross-site scripting, SQL injection, and all that stuff. Yeah.
And we just have a few announcements. There are additional security sessions being put out by the Trust Security team at Salesforce. And you can visit the developer forest where we have a booth and you can talk to any of our security engineers and ask security-specific questions about Salesforce and how to write secure code. We are also staffing an admin. If you are an administrator and you have questions specific about securing, through your administrator duties, you can visit the Admin Zone Security Cafe. And the additional sessions that are going on are on Wednesday, and you can check your brochure. We have 2 sessions on Wednesday, and another session on Thursday, and a session on Friday. And they're all security-related sessions, so I really encourage you to attend as many of those as you can. Thank you very much.